All right, let's talk about these noon games coming up tomorrow. Week 3 of the 2024 college football season. We got good games all day long. I want to, in this video, talk about the early games. I'll be streaming on Patreon for all the noon games. So those of you who are members over there, I'll post a link on Patreon around 11:45 tomorrow morning. Just head over to the Patreon page, click the link. It'll take you to tomorrow's live stream for all these noon games, and we got some good ones. There's a link in the description of this video if you want to check out the Patreon page. But I want to talk today about Bama at Wisconsin, LSU at South Carolina, Memphis at Florida State, and Boston College at Missouri, which is actually a 12:45 game, but still these are the early window games. Shout out to PrizePicks. They're sponsoring today's video. If you head over to PrizePicks and use promo code Uncle Lou, they got a great deal for you. Make any $5 play over on PrizePicks, and whether you win or lose, they're going to give you $50. It's that simple. I mean, it couldn't be any easier. Make a $5 play. Doesn't matter whether you win or lose. They give you $50. Check out PrizePicks.com. Promo code Uncle Lou. I'm going to pull PrizePicks up in a second and show you something I like here on the Alabama game. It might surprise you, but let's start with the Alabama game. Alabama on the road at Wisconsin. Now, this is looking very similar to last year, right? For Alabama, they had the South Florida game last year. It didn't go well. A lot of questions. What does this mean? Oh my God, Bama's going to lose 3 games, yada, 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 right? Well, it came out the next week. They beat Ole Miss 24-10, and kind of the rest is history. They did lose to Texas, but they went on to win the SEC and make the playoffs, and South Florida game didn't matter at all. Same thing this year, right? Alabama comes to Tuscaloosa. Weird game until like 4 minutes to go. It was a 1-point game, 14-13. Bama exploded for 28 points in the last like 3 or 4 minutes of the game. So the final score was lopsided, but 56 minutes of that game was extremely competitive. And there were some worrying signs for Alabama in that game. Now, it doesn't mean that they're going to be bad going forward. And what happened last year doesn't mean that they'll be good going forward. These are legitimate questions to have about Alabama right now. The offensive line appears to be a bit of a mess. They made some changes in that South Florida game, and we'll find out going forward if that sort of fixes the issue. But not a good look for Alabama last weekend at home. Now they get to go on the road and play Wisconsin. Now, Wisconsin hasn't been that impressive to me either. In fact, I'm a little bit disappointed in Luke Fickell through the first, he's been there 1 year. This now his second year, but there was this promise of opening things up and kind of a more modern day grown up offense, as opposed to sort of the between the tackles, ground and pound that Wisconsin had become accustomed to for the last 20 years or so, it seemed. And we've yet to really see that. They haven't been that good. They brought in Tyler Van Dyke to play QB, and he hasn't played well. And Wisconsin is 2-0, but their wins have not been impressive. Now you can say the same thing about Bama. I guess. I mean, the scores were lopsided, but they haven't looked great either. Bama just appears to be a much more talented team to me than Wisconsin. And as much as I like Luke Fickell, took Cincinnati to the playoffs, and that was a great story, hasn't really appeared to click to me yet at Wisconsin. I think it's going to be extremely difficult for Wisconsin to pull off the upset here. They're a 16-point underdog at home. I have not bet this game. I probably won't bet this game, but I actually like Bama to win, and I wouldn't be surprised if they won by 3 scores, which would cover the 16. But I want to head over to PrizePicks and show you this. This is curious to me, especially for the Alabama fans, what y'all think about this. But check this out. All right, of course, PrizePicks is it's like a daily fantasy football player props, basically. Really what you're doing is you're betting more or less on a certain stat involving a certain player, right? And you place anywhere between 2 and 6 picks. And obviously, the more picks you make, the higher the payout would be if you hit. But I wanted to look at these numbers for Jalen Milroe because it's been kind of a funny back and forth this week. He had 2 yards rushing against South Florida. Now, one thing to keep in mind when it comes to college football that's different, of course, in the NFL. In college football, a sack on a quarterback goes against his rushing totals. So you have to keep that in mind, right? So at the end of the game, Jalen Milroe's total rushing numbers last week against South Florida were 2. That's extremely low. PrizePicks has it at 44.5 right here. Look at this. Bama QB Jalen Milroe versus Wisconsin. More or less than 44.5 rushing yards. I actually like the more. I think he's going to have to run more. To me, that's one of the more concerning things from last week. I understand the issues along the offensive line, right? But seems to me like one way to negate an offensive line that might not be holding up like you want it to is to have a quarterback that can run around, evade pressure, escape the pocket, and take off downfield. And we've seen Milroe do that a ton during the course of his career, but for whatever reason, never really got going against South Florida. Again, the sacks come off your rushing totals, and I get that, but 2 total rushing yards for Milroe, extremely low. I like the over 44 and a half. Now I want to come down here to another one. The green goblins here that are easier bets to hit because the numbers are lower. So for an example, Jalen Milroe, 0.5 rushing and receiving touchdowns. Now he's not going to have a receiving touchdown, so you're basically just betting, will he score a rushing touchdown more than 0.5, which would be 1, right? Pretty easy to hit that. Chances are that he will. Will he have more than 1.5 though? So in other words, we have 2, and you can see the red devil here. That's a little harder bet to hit. The payouts are higher on the red devil bets than they are the green devil bets. I think he does have 2 rushing touchdowns this week or more. I mean, he might have more. So I'm going to take Milroe over 1.5 rushing touchdowns and Milroe over 44.5 rushing yards. And you could see a $20 bet here is going to win me $115. But I'm curious what y'all think about that with Jalen Milroe compared to what we saw last week with just the 2 yards. But check it out, PrizePicks.com. Make sure you use promo code Uncle Lou. You make any $5 play. So for an example, if I wanted to make this a $5 play, I've got a chance to win $28.75 off of my $5 play. If I don't hit, even if I lose this $5, they're going to give me $50 either way. Win or lose, they're going to give me $50 just for making this first $5 play. PrizePicks.com, promo code Uncle Lou. All right, there you go. Make sure you check them out. Some of you Alabama fans might be surprised that I'm on the over for Jalen Milroe. I've been critical of Jalen Milroe going back to last year. Most of my criticism involving Jalen Milroe, though, has been his ability or lack thereof, really his inability to, with sort of the intermediate throws, sort of his ability to read a defense, progress through his options and, fire a strike 15 to 20 yards downfield. He's got a great deep ball. And, of course, anybody can throw screens, and his athletic ability in terms of escapability, extending plays, taking off and running, sort of the home run threat, right? He's obviously got all that. And I expect him to use that this week on the road at Wisconsin, which is why I'm taking the over 1.5 rushing touchdowns for Milroe and over 44.5 rushing yards. But maybe Wisconsin finds a way to keep this thing close in the first half. I just look at Wisconsin and I look at Bama, and athletically, Wisconsin appears to be at such a disadvantage here. And I get it. Maybe you say the same thing about South Florida. And Alabama just played bad. I'm willing to give teams usually the benefit of the doubt once, right? If you go back to like the Florida State Georgia Tech game, they looked terrible, right? Well, the very next week they played Boston College, and what did I do? I picked Florida State. I'm like, okay, that was a bad showing. Florida State's still a talented team. They'll get it together. They'll beat Boston College, but they didn't do it. That's 2 games in a row. Well, now I'm off the Florida State train, which we'll talk about in a minute when I talk about their game with Memphis. But I still think Bama's one of the most talented teams in the country. I think Kalen DeBoer is still a pretty good coach, and I think Alabama goes on the road to Wisconsin and gets a win over the Badgers. LSU at South Carolina, the game day game this week, for reasons unknown. There are probably 10 games, I think, that would have been better for game day to go to than this one. Pretty much any of the games we're talking about here, with the exception of the Memphis Florida State game, I think would have been a better option. Bama at Wisconsin, obviously. Boston College at Missouri, 2 ranked and undefeated teams. But nevertheless, they are in Columbia, South Carolina this weekend. Williams-Brice Stadium, the Gamecocks hosting LSU. South Carolina, of course, 2-0. And a weird start to the season for South Carolina. Looked terrible week 1 against Old Dominion. Lucky to get out of that thing with a win. The fans were ready to ship Beamer out of town on the first thing smoking. And you look at the schedule and you say, oh, no, they got to go on the road and play Kentucky and Lexington. This isn't going to be good. And then Kentucky just completely imploded in a way that I have not seen Kentucky implode in a long, long time, maybe ever under Stoops. So you're talking the better part of the last 10 years. I haven't seen Kentucky play that bad in a long time. Now, credit to South Carolina, particularly their defense. They kept Kentucky backed up in the shadow of their own end zone for pretty much the entirety of the game. If you watched it, you know what I'm talking about. But literally every time I looked up at the TV, Brock Vandagriff was in a shotgun standing on his own goal line. Played terrible. South Carolina had him confused, dazed. He running around like he didn't know exactly what he was doing. He was unsure of himself. He looked unconfident. He didn't look good at all. And South Carolina blew him out 31-6. So game day says, well, instead of going to Lexington for the Georgia-Kentucky game, off to Columbia for the LSU-South Carolina game. LSU, of course, lost week 1 in a pretty close, hard-fought game against Southern Cal. won this past weekend against a lower classification school, Nichols, if I remember correctly. Kind of like with the Bama Wisconsin game here, I'm going with just the team that I feel like is more talented and probably has the better coach. And that's LSU, again, on the road. I think they'll be a little bit too much for South Carolina. I still like Nussmeier as a quarterback. Obviously, he's not the athletic threat that somebody like Jaden Daniels was a year ago for LSU. But when it comes to standing in the pocket and making throws, I like what Nussmeier can do. The LSU defense looks a little bit better than what we saw last year, which was just horrendously bad by LSU standards. And South Carolina, even though they got that big win on the road against Kentucky, I still have too many questions about South Carolina, their big playability. I question their quarterback, Lenore Sellers, their running game, their ability to their offensive line. I mean, they only had 250 total yards of offense against Kentucky last week. So the score is one thing, 31-6. And I don't want to diminish that win for South Carolina. They played a good enough game. I mean, I'm not crapping on them in that way. But this wasn't some type of offensive explosion where they had 500 or 600 yards and the quarterback's going for 300 and they're rushing for 250. They had 250 total yards for the game. I just don't think South Carolina is going to be able to sustain enough offense in this game to keep up with LSU. I think LSU wins. This could be really close in the first half. South Carolina can be a tough place to play at times. Their fans don't care. Well, I don't want to say they don't care. Of course they care. I was about to say their fans don't care if they're 0-12 or 12-0. That's not true. What I mean is they show up at the game the same, regardless of what South Carolina's record is. And in this case, they're 2-0 and they've got game day there. So they've got every reason in the world for the crowd to be into this game. And I think it will be a factor, especially in the first half. And I could see this thing being pretty close in the first half. The spread is 6.5, so just under a touchdown. I like LSU in this game at anything under 7. So if I can get LSU at 6.5, I'll take LSU to win and cover that 6.5 point spread. I think they probably win by 7 to 10 points on the road in Columbia. Now, one of the more interesting ones of the day to me, Memphis at Florida State. And it's crazy to say that a week 3 game against a group of 5 school is a must-win game for Florida State, but it sure feels that way. Now, I think all of Florida State's goals are already flushed down the toilet anyway. I don't think they are making the ACC title game, never mind winning the ACC. So obviously, I don't think they're making the playoffs or contending for a national title. And if you believe the Florida State fans and their coaches and the team in the offseason, that was their stated goal, and they're not getting there. 2 horrendous losses to start the season, and to make matters worse, they were both conference losses. So Florida State's 0-2 in the ACC. They still have to play Miami. They still, I mean, their entire season really is still ahead of them. They play Florida at the end of the year. That's a non-con game. But if Florida State loses this game at home to Memphis, it's going to be one of the more embarrassing losses of Mike Norvell's time at Florida State. He, of course, came from Memphis. He was the head coach at Memphis when he took the job at Florida State. Now Memphis comes to town as a group of 5 team poised to potentially make the playoffs. A lot of people have them picked as the group of 5 team that will end up making the 12-team playoff this year. There's a group of about 5 or 6 G5 schools that most people have circled as the most likely team to make that 12-team playoff. And Memphis is in every one of those lists that you see. They're a really good team. They're balanced. They have a quarterback who has set a school record in passing yards. They running back going over 100 a game. They're rushing for almost 200 a game as a team. Very balanced team. And for Memphis, this is their Super Bowl, right? These G5 teams who want to make the playoffs, this is their opportunity to sort of prove it here, right? We belong type of deal to go on the road, in this case to Florida State, and beat a Power 5 team. Now, it's not Memphis' fault that Florida State lost those 2 games, and they're coming in there to win this thing. I don't think they're going to be intimidated. I don't think they're going to be scared or frightened. And I think they've got a pretty good chance of pulling off the upset here. Florida State is a 7-point favorite at home for reasons unknown to me. I haven't seen a single thing from Florida State this entire season that tells me they should be a 7-point favorite in this game. Their offensive line has been bad. Their quarterback has obviously been bad. Their running backs have not got going. Wide receivers, even when DJU has made a decent throw, which hasn't been very often, the wide receivers have struggled with dropped passes or dropped catches. The defense has let them down at critical times, particularly the defensive front. They've been pushed around now by 2 different teams, Georgia Tech and Boston College. There's literally not a single bright spot really to point to for Florida State. They did have a bye week last week. So if they've got any chance of getting it together this season, you would think it would happen now at home against Memphis in a pretty big game. I don't see it happening. I'll gladly take Memphis in the 7 points here. If Memphis loses, I don't see it being by more than 7. I think this will be a close game. And I think there's a very good chance Memphis goes in there and wins outright. Florida State is down bad. And the last one, Boston College at Missouri. Talked about Boston College a little bit a minute ago. They're one of those 2 teams that pushed Florida State around in the trenches. And I think they're going to show up at this game on the road in Columbia, Missouri, and attempt to do the same thing. Missouri ranked absurdly high, in my opinion, at 6. I do not think they're the 6th best team in the country. They're a really good team. They're a top 15 team for sure. I think they're a borderline playoff team, but top 6, I don't know. Luther Burden, one of the best, if not the best wide receivers in the country. Brady Cook is back at quarterback. They did lose their rusher from last year, Cody Schrader. They lost their defensive coordinator and several key pieces off of a really good defense last year. But Missouri has played lights out so far this year. Now, it's been against lower competition, but in 2 games, they've won a combined 100 and something to nothing. They've yet to give up a single point. Boston College has got to be able to slow this game down, because as good as Boston College is potentially along the lines of scrimmage, and we saw some of that in the Florida State game, they don't have the ability to keep up in a track meet style game with Missouri. If the more points that get scored in this game, the less likely it becomes that Boston College wins or even keeps it close. They're going to have to try to slow this thing down, play like a time of possession, ground control game offensively, long sustained drives, multiple first downs to kind of keep Missouri's offense off the field. And I just don't think they'll be able to do that in the long run. I don't think Boston College, I like their quarterback. He's gritty. He's tough. He can extend plays. He can pick up a first down for you with his legs when you need him to. They've got a couple of good running backs too. But I don't think over the course of this game, they're going to have enough offensively to keep up with Missouri. So I think Missouri wins the game. Now, they're a 15.5-point favorite. I actually, earlier in the week, this thing was at 17. If you can get it back towards around 17, maybe you could think about taking Boston College and the points. But at 15.5, it's a no play for me. I do think Missouri wins the game. I probably won't bet this either way. But at 15, if you forced me to make a decision, I'd probably go with Missouri to cover the 15. I think Missouri just too much offense for Boston College. All right, there you go. 4 of the biggest games of the day on at noon. Bama at Wisconsin. I've got Bama winning big. LSU at South Carolina. I like LSU to win by about 10. Memphis at Florida State. I love Memphis in the free 7 points, and I think there's a good chance Memphis can win the game outright. And then Boston College at Missouri, maybe close for a little while. I think too much offense for Missouri. They win by 2 or 3 scores. Be sure and check out PrizePicks.com. Use promo code Uncle Lou. Make your first $5 play. And whether you win or lose, they're going to give you $50. I appreciate you watching. Hit the thumbs up. Subscribe if you're new. And I'll talk to you again soon. Have a good morning.